So why did we not podcast for several weeks? I guess I had the first excuse. Oh, I had the first two excuses, and then you had an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
So my excuse was my kid had his first birthday party. And
Yay!
I was like, ugh, I just don't want to do it after dumb birthday party all day.
It will be forever in your permanent record that the birthday party was dumb.
Well, they're a 1 year old. They don't remember it.
That's true.
And he's like, what are all these people doing in my house? And then we were going to push it and record it on Monday night, and that Monday was a really great day to me. So I got to work, and I had a whole bunch of leftover cupcakes and Rice Krispie treats my wife had made. So I left them out of my car initially, and I went into work because I was carrying in my laptop and an umbrella and a bunch of junk. And so I was like, I'll just come back out to my car and get them in a little while. So, about 8 a.m., I come back out to my car, and I hit the remote because I have like an ancient car that has like a remote and keys and stuff. You don't just wave your hand at it. And so I hit the remote and I walk over to the passenger side and I go to pull the door open and the door handle breaks off. And it's kind of shocking.
A little bit.
And yeah, so it breaks off and I'm like, well, that stinks. So I get the cupcakes and the Rice Krispie treats out and I just take them in and I'm like, it's the company parking lot. It's not like people are going to come in and like figure out the door handle's busted and know an exploit to open the car if the door handle's busted.
An exploit.
So I'm like, the security risk is very low. And so I just leave it. I go back in the building. And so after a little while, I pull my cell phone out of my pocket and the case is bulging out. And so the battery has like bulged up and I would eventually have to replace the battery later that afternoon. But then one of my project managers comes over and he says, hey, this project is, oh my God, everything's going wrong. We have this discrepancy. And, he's this like hugely overweight guy who's on the cusp of dying all the time. The short of it is that I got sent to Florida on like 5 hours notice to go like save the schedule on this program. And it did turn out like I got to the customer site Tuesday morning and by Wednesday morning I had solved the problem. So it did turn out to be an easy fix, but it was obnoxious. I had to spend the rest of the week in Florida.
Wait, why the rest of the week?
Well, because we had made reservations and return trip tickets and they charge you a ton to change them. And like we had fixed the problem, but then we have to get people to sign off on the fix and test it and everything. We can't close the issue ourselves and that kind of stuff.
You should have just slapped on a space diaper and made a 10-hour drive back.
Just throw a BB gun in my car and BB gun ammunition.
You could have done it. It's been done before.
So it was quite the day, but that was the reason that the Monday podcast got canceled. And then the next week, Blake had a lame excuse.
Yeah, my lame excuse was the Great American Eclipse. I and my wife were driving to Oregon and did some clock math wrong and just ended up getting there like 2 hours later than we expected to. So then we just ran out of time. And the eclipse was awesome. I'm guessing you haven't seen one still?
No. We had like a 75% here, and I didn't go look at it. I was like, who cares? I was more interested in how dark will it get outside at the maximum. So at that point, I walked over to the windows in the area I work, and I looked outside at all the people with their welding helmets looking up at the sky.
I bet you couldn't tell a difference.
It seemed like I could. It seemed like just kind of a cloudy day.
Yeah.
But we get a direct one coming over DFW here in 2024.
Yeah, I saw. I'll probably come visit then. So it was really cool. If you're in an area that gets like 98% occlusion, you're still missing out, I would say. All the coolness happens in the last little bit, like the last 1% to totality and then back. I didn't actually care about going to see it. Like if I had been single, I would have been like, how often a solar eclipse happens? I mean, arguably they're happening all the time, right? You're just not in the right position. But I was like, who cares? And my wife was like, how many solar eclipses are ever going to happen? I was like, millions? I don't know. It doesn't matter. But she's like, no, let's go. I want to see it. My dad has talked this up for just decades because he saw the one in the 60s or 70s or whatever. So we drove up to Oregon into the path of totality to see it. And it's really cool. I thought, it's going to look like the photos. But what photos don't really capture is the dynamic range of what it means to have full daytime sunlight and then almost nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So we were looking at it through our eclipse glasses, and I can confirm it's really boring up until about 90%. If you look at the sun for just a second, like looking at it and blinking, it just doesn't look any different. Even when it's almost completely occluded, it's just still so bright. And you look around and it's like a cloudy day, but with slightly different coloration, because there's not a cloud doing it, it's just dimmer. But then once the moon actually covers the sun, if you look at it with your eclipse glasses, you can't see anymore because it's so much dimmer than the sun, like the corona. And so you can just look at the corona with the naked eye. It was way bigger than I expected visually. It's many times the radius of the sun. And it just looked really cool. It's just like there's a giant weird looking thing in the sky, and it was really neat, and all the birds freak out, and it's actually really dark outside, and a whole bunch of automated light systems come on at gas stations and stuff, and that was cool. And we had a really good spot to look at it, and it was just really neat, and I'm really glad that I saw it. And I would say if other people are sort of debating what to do when the 2024 one comes around, it's probably worth taking a trip and the inconvenience to see it. You don't really need to see 2 eclipses in your life that much, but you'd probably like having seen one. You'll always have that. So I thought it ended up being worth it. And then our great estimating skills told us, well, there will probably be some traffic driving up to the eclipse because supposedly millions of people are going to go try to see it. And so we timed our drive and stayed at a hotel, and we are like, this is going to deal with it. And then we thought, well, what'll happen right after the eclipse? I don't know. Let's not try to think about it and figure out what to do. And so we did not correctly anticipate that literally everyone in the entire US would be driving out of the path of totality back to wherever their home was. So we ended up being in traffic for just as long on the way back, but we only covered like 60% of the distance to home. And then we stayed at a hotel. And as a bit of follow-up to the Tesla podcast, our hotel was right next to a Tesla supercharger station.
Yeah.
And so we pulled in, and I said, why are there all those Teslas over there? And my wife was like, well, I think they're just parking. And I was like, yeah, but with their headlights on? And so then I walked over there, and we heard a bunch of fans, and the cars all had their trunks open, or frunks, or whatever. And it was just 5 charging slots, and then a line of 3 other cars waiting to charge at those spots. And then a whole bunch of middle-aged white guys standing around talking about their Teslas. Oh yeah, I got the 85D. I didn't need the P because whatever. And everyone was just waiting in line. It didn't look like a fun way to spend the end of your evening. In their defense, though, everyone went to see the eclipse. So maybe that's why it was relatively overloaded. But I was glad that I could just fill up at gas stations in 10 minutes and be gone. So that was our eclipse experience. It was pretty cool.
So I ordered another door handle for my car.
Mm-hmm.
And I went searching on the internet for how to fix it. And there were no videos and there were no shop manuals that anyone had pirated. And there were no instructions. And so I ended up just filming myself doing it and edited a video together that I'm going to put on YouTube. So for the first time ever, I will add value to the internet.
The first time ever?
Yes.
Don't you post in a lot of places?
Yeah, but that doesn't add any value.
You're just like, lol.
I just like to make people angry.
That's a certain kind of value.
But now, if anyone in the future needs to know how to change the exterior door handle on a 3rd generation Mazda Miata, there will be this video.
I've always wondered about that myself.
Yeah.
Could you also post a video on how to exploit someone's car if the right door handle has fallen off?
You know, I read Schneier for way too many years because that's what I immediately thought. I was just like, if my door handle's broken, can somebody get in?
You know, some coworker of yours looked at your car and said, it's my lucky day. And they pulled their Mazda Miata toolkit out of their glove box. Got to work.
They unroll it, and it's a bunch of little picks that are shaped really crazy on the end. And they take 3 of them and, like, stick them in at certain angles and start working at it.
Someone else walks up and says, why don't you just use a Slim Jim? They're like, a what?
Why don't you just break the window?
Why don't you just cut the cloth top?
Yeah. Why don't you just take the existing rip in the cloth top and just pull it open more?
It's already ripped.
It just happened a few months ago,
Oh.
and it's right on the driver's side where I get in, and it's like, so it's right in front of me when I get in the garage every morning, and I just noticed it.
That's so sad.
Yeah, it's really aggravating because you can never have those things like redone and have them correct. No one can ever manufacture a replacement cloth top for a convertible and have it fit correctly and go up and down correctly. There's something screwy about it. I don't know. I've never heard anyone who's happy with having a replacement done.
Can you stitch it up?
No, there's all kinds of like crappy patches you can put on with adhesives and stuff.
Well, that sucks. You could just get an entirely new car. Maybe a Model S?
You know, my dream has been that this car would hold out until I could buy a fully autonomous luxury sedan.
How many years away do you think we are?
Probably too many. And driving a Miata was really fun 10 years ago when I bought it. And now I'm 10 years older. And I got to climb in and out of it. And it's got a rough ride and it's really noisy. You know, it's just not a fun car anymore.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. I hear you can get a Nissan Leaf that's just come off a lease for like $7,000.
Ah, you saw that.
There's so much uncertainty about their drivetrains and the warranties and everything. You can pick them up real cheap.
Do you really want to Leaf?
Well, it's super cheap, and for the driving I do, it'd be fine.
Does it come with a mask so you can conceal your face and you don't have to feel the shame of driving a Leaf?
I don't care. I live about 4 miles from work, so I do very little driving.
Yeah, it'd probably be a pretty good car for you then.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not really worried about driving the Miata for, you know, maybe another 5 or 6 years until I can get an autonomous car.
Do you really need an autonomous car to drive 4 miles?
I don't expect to be driving 4 miles still in that time. I would hope that I'm not still working at the place I'm working now.
Okay, so today we're talking about cryptocurrency, right? Unless there's something you wanted to talk about.
No, I think that's a good topic.
All right, so I hear you have some cryptocurrency.
Some. I hear you have some cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I have Bitcoin and only Bitcoin.
Okay. I have some Bitcoin and 1 Ethereum.
1?
Yes.
Why do you have 1?
Because I decided to keep 1 on the small outside chance that it does something amazing.
That it's worth.
On the outside chance that somebody finally comes up with a single useful thing to do with the smart contracts.
Well, they're really useful for getting hacked and losing all your money. They're pretty good at that. Also, I think it's 1 Ether that you have, not 1 Ethereum.
Yeah, okay.
I think maybe one day your Ether will be worth more than a share of Tesla. So there's that.
I think it just on normal fluctuations, like right now, it could be.
All right, I gotta look.
Tesla's like 360 right now, and Ether is what, like 280 or something?
Okay, Ethereum's 350.
Oh, wow.
Your little Ether, it's doing so well. And Tesla is 348. Oh, that's great. And it's going down, and Ether's going up. We'll see. I'm surprised that you even have the 1 Ether. There's a lot of people at work who are into cryptocurrencies, like you might expect. And some of them have posted sort of, not the amounts that are in their portfolios, but their percentage breakdowns. And a lot of them have a lot of different cryptocurrencies. They'll just rattle off all these different letters that I've never heard of. It's like, oh, what is that? And it's like, oh, it's a cryptocurrency for managing dental patient calendars or something like that. I'm serious. That's a real cryptocurrency. None of them have it. And I sort of view none of these currencies is really adding that much value on top of what Bitcoin already does. I think Bitcoin is sort of the one true cryptocurrency.
I feel like a lot of these other ones kind of serve the same role that penny stocks serve for people who are new to investment and really haven't spent a lot of time reading about stocks and the stock market and investing. And so they get into it and they see penny stocks, and then they see penny stocks against things like a share of Google that's what, like $1,000 or $1,200 or something, or a share of Amazon that's nearly $1,000, and a share of Berkshire Hathaway that's like $120,000 or something. Mm-hmm. And they don't really understand that one share of one company is not equivalent to one share of another company. and that the total number of shares of different companies are different.
I hadn't really thought about that being an issue for people, but that makes sense.
It is, and when you talk to people, sometimes they'll specifically talk about that, and they'll reveal it by saying something like, "Oh yeah, Google or Amazon or Berkshire Hathaway are so expensive, but these penny stock companies, their stock is so cheap." And it's like, well, on some way of measuring, yes, and on some way, no, but one share of one is not comparable to one share of the other. And so you'll sometimes meet people who are, and I don't want to come across as condescending, but unsophisticated. And they'll be into penny stocks because, wow, it can swing 20% in a day. And it's like, well, that's generally a bad sign.
Well, it depends on what your goal is.
Okay, yeah, I agree.
If you expect to be trading every day, then that's kind of a desirable attribute. Also, if you think you're a genius and you think you have some kind of ability to deal with the market's fluctuations, then you'd want volatility most of the time, right?
Again, from an unsophisticated perspective, yes. I think you can argue those things, but I think that ultimately those people don't make much money.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah. And so I feel like all these other cryptocurrencies that are out there, most of them, or maybe all of them besides Bitcoin, serve that purpose to greater or lesser extents.
Yeah.
And so people come into cryptocurrency and then they see, wow, Bitcoin is, I don't know, $4,500 or something right now. And they think, I could buy one Bitcoin and it would cost way more money than I'm comfortable investing in cryptocurrency. Or I could buy 100,000 of whatever the hell coin.
Mm-hmm.
They enjoy seeing, oh man, I have 100,000 of these coins. And they enjoy indulging in the kind of lottery fantasy of, well, if one day it went to $100, I could buy an island,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that probably happens a lot. And those people don't fully explain because it's a little embarrassing. Like, you don't go read online.
And to an extent, I think they may not understand their own motivations there.
That's probably true. One difference, though, is you can buy fractional shares of cryptocurrency. So you can look at Bitcoin and go, oh, it's so expensive. I'm going to buy 100th. And that's pretty achievable, at least right now.
Yeah, that's true. But I would wonder if people would feel like, man, I own 1,000th of a Bitcoin. This sucks.
It just passively weighs on you. You go to work and you're like, 1,000th of Bitcoin. You come home, 1,000th of a Bitcoin. You're like, I just can't do it anymore.
Instead, I have 50,000 whatever coin.
I thought I was investing, but instead I have a burden. But you could still say, well, I think Bitcoin's going to go up by some percent. And so turning that many dollars into it and then theoretically turning back into dollars later would mean you're going to make that much gain. And everyone understands dollars.
Right.
Could still make some money. But I saw this interesting viewpoint where someone described other cryptocurrencies as a forking attack on Bitcoin. They were trying to fork it at block zero. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about it. Because in terms of being a store of value, there's not a lot of reason to use another currency over Bitcoin. Or in this case, we could just call it like cryptocurrency. They're not necessarily a currency. People like to argue about that. But in terms of being a crypto store of value, Bitcoin's like the big daddy. And so Ethereum is a real contender, I think, but it's only because people believe the hype about it. And like you said, smart contracts have yet to bear any real kind of fruit.
Right. And, I bought into Ethereum maybe a year and a half ago or earlier. I don't know. It was about $8 when I bought into it. And I thought, oh, well, two things. One, I wanted Augur to come along and I wanted to take people's money by predicting events better than they could. And two, I thought, well, smart contracts will be a cool idea and someone will have like the killer app idea with smart contracts and do something. And then for the last year and a half, it's just kind of been like, when is that going to happen? And no one's done it. And I had this other realization, which was there's that graph of valuation over time as like smart money comes into an investment and then the institutional investors and then the public hears about it. And it's kind of the skyrocketing valuation graph. And then eventually it crashes and it returns to the mean,
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, in reality, cryptocurrencies are doing that on kind of a repeating basis. And they kind of spike up for a while and then they'll crash down and revert to the mean, which means that they still increase over time. But after another year, 18 months or so, they kind of get popular in the media again, or there will be some global event where, it's useful for people in some country or some part of the world to use it, and they'll drive up the price some. And then that kind of gets it back in the public eye again. And then it goes through this cycle again. And you feel like you can see that over and over and over again on the price graph over time.
For Bitcoin.
Yes, with Bitcoin. I had this realization that ultimately what drives the value into the future is what's typically called dumb money. And what dumb money really means is not that you're stupid, it means that you're not well informed early on. So you don't make money every day as an investment person, right? You're not educated in finance, you're not plugged in every hour of the day to the financial world, and you're not able to see these events coming as they're approaching. Instead, you're just a regular person who works some other job, and so you usually only see these events after they're reported on. So you are the dumb money. And so you typically chase the investments and you try to pile in after the best opportunity has already passed. And that's what's happened with Bitcoin. And so the realization is, for the future, and for Bitcoin to keep growing, you have to keep piling in more and more dumb money. And over time, that will happen. And the way that comes in is through media awareness. And so more and more new people learn about it, and more opportunities present themselves where Bitcoin is useful for people to adopt for various reasons. And that drives the price higher over time. And so the media driving new dumb money in can only support so many different cryptocurrencies.
Oh, yeah.
And so it can easily support Bitcoin because everybody's heard of Bitcoin. Even people who have no idea what a cryptocurrency is or how it works, or think it's going to zero, or even have just a tiny understanding of what it is, they've all heard of Bitcoin. But how many people have heard of Ethereum or Litecoin or whatever the next ones down are? Very, very few people.
Yeah.
And how many people who don't own cryptocurrencies and have never owned cryptocurrencies have ever heard of any of them besides Bitcoin? And so it's an awareness problem. And so the media awareness and, kind of global current event type things will drive people into cryptocurrency, but they'll specifically drive them into Bitcoin because that's what people have heard about. And that's a problem that other cryptocurrencies will have incredible trouble overcoming, no matter what their technical merits.
Yeah, I think so. And really, no one cares about their technical merits.
Yeah.
If you look at most cryptocurrencies and people talking about them, in general, no one understands what any of them do. Most people don't really understand how Bitcoin works. And
yeah,
it's arguably almost the simplest cryptocurrency. I don't think there are very many others that are simpler that are actually trading for real money. A few people have made ones where they're like, oh, here's my demo of a little cryptocurrency just so you can understand it. But it's almost the simplest. And I often run into people who they'll say something to me like, don't miners verify that transactions are valid? And I'm like, well, it's complicated. And then I explain it. And they're like, you're right, it's complicated. What is a transaction? That's a good one. Do you know what a Bitcoin transaction is?
You send money from one address to another.
It's way more complicated than that. You actually create a little script in a scripting language called script, actually. And you push some entries onto a stack, and then they get popped off and they get verified. It's so much more complicated. And the reason that exists is because Satoshi, when inventing Bitcoin, originally intended for it to support smart contracts. And it basically does. It supports certain classes of smart contract. Not the craziness that Ethereum supports, but you can still do things like require 2 out of 2 people to sign something to move money around. And virtually no one uses that in Bitcoin. That was the main reason that I never understood why anyone cared about Ethereum. Because Bitcoin already supports all this stuff. Well, it doesn't support everything, but it supports a lot of stuff and no one's using it. You can go look through the blockchain and say, how often has someone made a multi-sig transaction? Which is where it requires multiple signatures to move money. And it's like really infrequent. And so Bitcoin's a blockchain, and a blockchain it's not the most complicated structure ever invented. It basically has blocks, and it needs three things to work. It needs like some kind of data that you're storing. Like in the case of Bitcoin, it's who owns what Bitcoin. But it has to have data in it, otherwise it's just stupid. You're just creating this list for no reason. So you got to have that. And so then you say, okay, well, how am I going to secure my list so that people can't go back in time and rewrite history and mess with it? And so you need some kind of proof of work. You need something where people have to do something that's hard to do, and they have to be able to write a record that they did it into the blocks so that you know that effort was spent creating this record, and it makes it costly to rewrite history. And so that means that when someone sends you a copy of the record, some computer program that you have can verify it and say, yes, this record was hard to produce. And it means that a forgery would have to be at least equally hard to produce. Otherwise, you would just know it's a forgery.
But your verification has to be easy.
Yes. It has to be relatively easier. Yeah. And so then you say, well, why is anyone going to do a whole bunch of work on my stupid blockchain in order to keep these records? And so you have to have some form of incentive. You have to have a reason for people to do this proof of work on your chain. Otherwise, nobody's going to bother securing it. In the case of Bitcoin, it's really simple. When you do a proof of work thing, like when you mine a block, you get a reward of some number of Bitcoins and you just send it to yourself. There you go. That's your incentive. So if you don't have all three of those things, you have nothing. You have a press release or something like that. You don't have a real product. You don't have something that's going to be able to actually provide any real value in the world. And so when I read about blockchains, like, oh, maybe Goldman Sachs wants to use a private blockchain to do asset reconciliation or something like that. By making it private, they're removing some of the incentive because only the private people are going to be able to contribute to this. And so they don't need to contribute very much to win. And the proof of work is going to be really, really weak because it's only going to be a proof of work done by a tiny select group of people, like private people. And so if at any point somebody decides to bring a whole lot more computation to bear on this, they'll be able to rewrite history and mess with a blockchain, which sort of undermines the entire point of it. The point of a blockchain is this distributed trust. Everyone in the world can trust that this blockchain is authentic because everyone in the world had a shot at trying to attack it and they couldn't succeed. So a private blockchain is sort of just an oxymoron. It doesn't even make sense. If you wanted to have a blockchain, about the best thing that you could do is somehow peg it to Bitcoin and say every block has to include a pointer to a Bitcoin block within recent history or something like that. You could probably do something like that. But then it's sort of like, why aren't you just writing your records into Bitcoin once in a while? And some people have taken to doing that. They'll take the hash of something and publish it in the Bitcoin blockchain. And that's a good way of saying, at this point in time, this value was this. And it establishes a high degree of trust for it.
So do they do that by taking the hash and then breaking it down as a string of numbers and doing transactions of that many Bitcoins?
You can just append additional info to a transaction.
Okay, I understand. So you can just like write a note?
Yeah. The blockchain is full of silly things. People have just written notes and put ASCII art in there and stuff like that.
Program Tetris.
Sure. A copy of Ethereum, maybe. So that's why I think the whole private blockchain thing is really silly. And I think we're just going to keep hearing about that for a really long time. I think maybe in the next couple of years, people will just keep saying private blockchain. Maybe we're going to do it this time. But if you're familiar with, say, Git, like the version control system, Git is actually a blockchain. And if you don't share it with anyone, it's a private blockchain. And nobody really says, oh, we're going to create a private blockchain. We'll just use Git. I guess first I should explain. So there's this thing called a cryptographic hash. It's really important to understand that concept. Do you feel like you get that?
Yes.
Okay. How would you describe it then?
Okay. So you have this set of mathematical problems that is really difficult to solve in one direction, but easier to solve in the other direction. For example, it's easy to multiply two big numbers, but given the product of the numbers, it's difficult to find all the prime factors.
Okay. I think you are describing an asymmetric cryptography system.
Okay, is that like a special case of what you're talking about?
No.
Okay.
So, like, what you're talking about here is the RSA encryption algorithm, where you would take two primes and you multiply them together, and you rely on the difficulty of factoring the resulting composite number as your security for your encryption scheme. For a hash, what you do is take some amount of data and mess with it in a way where it's extremely difficult to reverse what happened. A trivial example of a hash that's not cryptographic would be, I take all of the letters, I convert A to 1, Z to 26, etc. Then I just add them all together. And so for a lot of strings, you would end up with a unique sum of numbers. And so that's a really simple version of a hash. But then if someone says, I have the message AA, so it's 1, 1, and you add the numbers together, you get 2. Someone else could say, well, I'm going to forge your message or mess with your message in some way, and I'm going to use the string of B, where B is 2. And so both of those hash to 2 with your crappy hash algorithm. And that's obviously an undesirable effect. So a real cryptographic hash will be much more complicated. It takes all the bits, it shuffles them, it adds them together, it mixes them with themselves. And so the result is you take a big number or a big bunch of bits or a big bunch of letters or whatever, and you get an output that's much smaller. In the case of Bitcoin, it's 256 bits. And there's no way to know what input went into creating this output hash. There's no way to modify an input to get a specific output hash. And there's no way to create an output hash that's equal to another output hash without using or knowing exactly the same input. And so that's really useful because it means a Bitcoin block can be hashed, and then another Bitcoin block just needs to include the hash of the previous one. And we know that the second block was created after the first because there's no way to pre-calculate what a hash was going to be. And that's the reason that the blocks are in a chain, because they point back to each other using these hashes. And so sometimes people will call them a signature or say they're kind of like a digital signature. They don't really include any kind of identity proof in them. A real digital signature will say something like, this public key signed this bit of data. Whereas a hash just says, that data is represented by this little thing, this little bit of data. And it confirms that that other data like existed in that form. I hope that feels like a good explanation of it. Do you feel like it was explained well?
Yeah, I've heard explanations of hashes before.
Okay. So the hash thing is important. So the reason Git's a blockchain is because if you commit some code to Git, I believe you take the hash of how the repository was before, then you add your code in, and then you create a new hash of the current code and the old repository. And this new hash identifies where you are in the repository. And so every time you make a change to it, the new hash points back to all the old hashes. And so you know that like the previous record has its integrity, essentially. No one modified it beforehand. And it provides a very strong proof that no one modified it, unless they went back and modified a huge amount of it and then tricked you and made you think, oh, now you're actually on the real repository, but actually you're on the maliciously modified one. So, like, to give an example, you have repository A, which is the trustworthy one. You have repository B. So on A, you want to make a commit, but someone switches out A for B, and they give you this repository, and they say, actually, B, this is the canonical one. This is the real one. So you make your commit to it, and you trust that the hashes all point back to the same thing. So they've successfully convinced you to commit to a malicious repository. That's not really a problem in the Git world, because usually you're not committing monetary transactions. But in Bitcoin, it's really important. So you need some way to say, nobody switched out this blockchain for another one and convinced you to commit your transaction somewhere worthless. And that's why the proof of work is so important. You need some way to say, this blockchain was generated at great effort and great expense, and you can look at it and cheaply prove to yourself that it was generated at great effort. And so you know this is the real one. There's no way that there's two equally high effort Bitcoin blockchains out there in the world, because actually in the case now, there's just not enough computing power in the world to generate two of them. Nobody could do it. And so that's how you get the trust that's in Bitcoin. I trust that nobody has moved my money around in a way I didn't expect.
So can you clarify how each person verifying these transactions has a copy of the blockchain, and they verify against that. And then I've always been kind of unclear. Everybody begins with a copy of whatever the current blockchain is.
Mm-hmm.
Does everybody from there then just kind of in their own silo verify every transaction on their own and write their own independent version of the blockchain from then on? Or do copies of the blockchain communicate from time to time and people pick up the verifications of transactions that they did not in fact verify themselves?
Oh, that's a good question. I can see how that'd be super confusing.
Okay, so I guess we need to clarify a little bit. There's this huge network of computers in the world that does this verification, and it's controlled by all these people, and the idea is anybody can add processing power to this network. And essentially the network agrees. And so it says the majority of the network approves of this transaction and says that it's legitimate. And so each computer on that network has a copy of the blockchain.
Yeah.
But if we want to look at this from any particular point in time, from just this instant, they have a copy of the blockchain right now. And then there's this deluge of Bitcoin transactions right now. What happens? Do all of those copies running on all these computers that are part of the Bitcoin network all verify all the transactions? Do they get split up and certain computers trust other ones, or what?
Nobody trusts anybody. That's part of the beauty of Bitcoin, is it's designed where everyone can be malicious and it will still work. And in effect, a lot of people are malicious around Bitcoin. There's a lot of people who are trying to do any kind of scam that they possibly can. So there's no trust at all. So what happens is you send a transaction out and you send it to everybody that you can. You find all the Bitcoin nodes that you can. Nodes have a way of advertising to each other, like I exist. It's important for nodes to know about other nodes. I'll explain that later. But you send a transaction to them. They don't have a whole lot of incentive to forward it along, but I believe that a lot of them do anyways. But you can also just broadcast it to every node. So you tell every node that you can find, hey, here's my transaction, move money from A to B. And so what incentivizes them to incorporate this transaction into a block is the transaction includes a fee. It'll say like give 0.01 Bitcoins to whoever successfully incorporates this into a block. And so everybody wants to include your transaction if it'll fit in the block. Let's not talk about that yet. So anyway, let's assume blocks are of infinite size. So they want to include your transaction because there's this little fee bit. And the fee in your transaction, you'll say something like, empty the wallet of A, pay some amount of it to B, and put the rest back into A. And that's your change, because you have to move all of the money in an entire wallet when you do a transaction. And then also take some tiny amount of money and give it to unspecified. And so you don't put an address on where that money is going to go. And what that is for is that's the fee. And so whenever someone mines a block, they make the address of that fee point to themselves. So then they take your money. And that's the incentive that you provide for them to incorporate it.
It's a transaction fee.
Yeah. But it's sort of weird to think about because you're essentially saying, give this money to whoever can take it from me and fight amongst yourselves to figure out how to take it. And so then what everyone does is they do literally fight amongst themselves. So everyone who's trying to mine, they're all competing against each other. There's no trust. There's no distribution of labor. They're all competing to do exactly the same thing. They want to find a cryptographic hash for a given block that is below a certain value. So if you think of representing a cryptographic hash as a number, they want to find one that's very, very low. Or represented in binary, it has a whole bunch of leading zeros. And so that's called the difficulty factor, like how low the number has to be. So because a cryptographic hash is unpredictable in terms of what its output is, you can think of it as it just generates a random number. And so if I give you this process, say I give you a black box, and you push a button on it, and it generates a floating point number for you. It generates something like 0.7 blah, blah, blah. You're like, okay. And so I'm like, push this button over and over until it generates a number that's below 0.00001. You can look at it and say, I'm going to be pushing this button for a really long time. So you push the button and it's like 0.5. You're like, push the button, 0.002. Oh, I was close. Push the button again, 0.9. So you have to push this button over and over and over. And That's how the cryptographic hash works, because you can't predict what its output's going to be. So you keep incrementing this number in the block. It's called the nonce. And you just increment it, or you don't even have to increment it. You can set it to whatever. But every time you change it, the block will hash to this completely different value. And so your goal is to find one that's really, really low. And once you have, then you can send out this block. And it includes a hash that points back to the previous block. It includes all the transactions. All of them point to yourself, which makes your block different from anyone else's block because they're not going to point them to themselves. And it includes the Coinbase transaction, which is like 12.5 Bitcoins right now, I think. And you send that to yourself. And then it has this hash of the block. And anyone can look at this hash and say, that's really, really low. That's like a 1 in a trillion chance that they would get that. Actually, I think it's a lot worse than that. It's like a 1 in a quadrillion chance that they would have found that. And so that hash proves that you did an enormous amount of work to find a valid block that hashed to such a low value. Anyone can look at it and just say, that's really low. And yes, that block hashes to that value. And so they can all prove to themselves.
Okay, and so then everyone else does two things. They say, I will include that block.
Yeah.
And I will give up trying to beat that score because I don't think I can economically do it for the electricity it will take.
Yeah. So once that block shows up, then they're like, oh, I am defeated. And they might as well say, yeah, that's the newest block. I'm going to start building on top of that one.
Okay. That answers a big question that I've never understood.
Oh, what is it?
Well, just how does everybody verify this? Because I remember I did a transaction once and it came back with some kind of, I guess it was at Coinbase or something. And it came back with some receipt or something that Coinbase generates or whatever. And it says something like, this transaction verified 180,000 times. And I was like, I guess, I tried to figure out what that might mean. And so this explanation was not on my list of things that this might mean.
Oh, I have no idea what it would mean to verify it 180,000 times.
I had assumed that so many participants in the network had decided that it was a legitimate transaction.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
One of the things that's kind of weird about it, and I think is commonly just misunderstood or not understood, is that all the miners are fighting with each other. They're playing a zero-sum game. Because if you mine a block, you take all of the money, and no one else gets any. And so then everyone else is just competing to mine the next block. And I think a lot of people think the miners are working together or something.
Is one transaction one block?
No, a block has many transactions in it.
So does only the person who completes the final transaction of a block get paid?
No, they just all go in there. Let's say I'm a miner. I get all these transactions from all around the world. And so I'm sitting there trying to mine a block, and I'm like cranking away on it with all of my GPUs or ASICs or whatever. And so every time a transaction shows up, I'm going to look and say, do I have enough space left in the block? Right now, they can only be 2 megabytes in size. And if the answer is yes, then I just put the transaction in the block also. And then I start grinding away on this new block that's different. All right, let's say I start with an empty block. And block 1000's already been mined. And so I'm trying to mine block 1001. So it's empty. I don't have any transactions. So I'm just sitting there grinding away saying, okay, I'm making block 1001. It points back to 1000. I'm trying to find a number that's low enough that I can get this 12.5 Bitcoin reward. So I'm grinding away on it. And then a transaction shows up from Coinbase to Craig or whatever. And so I'm like, oh, that has a fee in it. Great. So I'm just going to incorporate that into my block. So now my block has one transaction in it and I just keep grinding away. It changed slightly, but I can just keep grinding away undeterred. And then another transaction shows up. So now I have one from Craig back to Coinbase or whatever. Okay, so I incorporate that. And so I'm grinding away. And I'm just trying to solve this problem. Can I find a hash that's low enough that I get the rewards for this? And every time a transaction shows up, I'm going to incorporate it. Once the block is full, then I'm going to start saying, well, which transaction should I evict from the block in order to have the most money going to myself? And so I'll keep doing that. But I'm trying to fill up the block with maximum fees. Because I just want to steal all the fees. Like, I don't care about you. I don't care about your coins or anything like that. I'm just a selfish miner who's trying to get all the fees. So I'm going to mine the biggest block I can that has the fattest transaction fees and fit all the transactions in that I can. And so all the transaction people, all their money gets moved around, essentially. Like, once I've successfully mined the block, anyone can publicly verify A moved to B, B moved to C, whatever. They can verify that all these transactions occurred.
Are all transactions the same size within the block?
No, they don't have to be.
And transactions are not first in, first out.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you just said that, transactions are coming in and they need to be verified. But then other ones might come in and we might evict other transactions from the block.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't get processed in chronological order.
Right. A selfish miner is going to put in the transactions that give them the most fees. They can also choose to not incorporate any transactions if they're like a big jerk or, I don't know, dumb. You could actually just try and mine blocks that have no transactions. That is an attack that Bitcoin people have done on other blockchains that people have created. Like, they'll create some other cryptocurrency and a Bitcoin miner will point 1% of their mining capacity at this chain. And then they'll mine a whole bunch of blocks that don't have any transactions in them. And so it essentially stalls out that coin. The coin is like succeeding according to the rules of the game. New blocks are getting minted, but no one can use it because nobody can transact anything. So no one can buy it for dollars or sell it for dollars. It essentially drives down the liquidity of the currency to zero, which sometimes kills it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually happened. So the reason there's a transaction fee is because otherwise a miner will be like, well, screw you. I don't need to incorporate anything. I don't even need to be that network connected. I just need to be able to emit blocks. I don't need to be able to take in data. So they get to pick and choose.
Okay.
It's a little weirder than you would expect. You would sort of think there would be cooperation, but it's really important that it work when everyone's a selfish actor.
And it seems that this explanation you're giving assumes that we're at the stage of Bitcoin's life where the miner is getting paid only by fees and not by mining new blocks, not by generating new Bitcoins.
Yeah, and that won't happen until, I think it's like 2140 or something like that. Right now, anyone who mines a block just gets a reward of some amount of Bitcoins. Right now it's 12.5. Initially it was 50, then it was 25. It divides in half every 4 years. And so in enough time, it'll just be a rounding error and it goes to zero. And that was a very clever incentive that Satoshi put in place when he created Bitcoin, where he was like, this is going to reward early adopters very disproportionately because there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoins and the first people are mining 50 at a time in a big chunk. And I mean, now we can see with hindsight, 50 Bitcoins is a lot of money. It's like $200,000 or something like that at today's prices. So anyone who is mining with just a CPU and managed to not throw away their Bitcoins on an old hard drive has a huge amount of money now if they mined a single block. And you can see that everywhere you look in Bitcoin, like in the Bitcoin white paper, and sometimes in other cryptocurrencies, there's a bunch of really clever incentives that force everybody into doing the desired behavior, no matter how much they might hate each other or want to attack each other. And that's one of the things that's really great about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general. When I read the Bitcoin white paper, that was why I was so excited about it. Because the way I describe it now is Bitcoin is almost like creating this second type of government out of thin air. Before, if people had conflicts, the only way to resolve them was with organized force. So you might be like, okay, let's play rock, paper, scissors on the playground. And so your first way of resolving who wins this fight is through the rules. So someone throws rock, someone else throws paper, and you're like, paper wins. And they're like, well, nuh-uh. And so then you say, oh, I'm going to go get a teacher. And now the teacher can resolve it. They can tell the kids to do something. And so the kids are like, I don't want to do it. And so then, like, I don't know, let's keep extending this analogy. You can eventually call the cops or whatever. And the cops will make you do it at gunpoint with force. Or the court system or whatever. Eventually there's some organized use of force and they'll just make you do something. They'll be like, no, little Johnny wins, he threw paper. So you're going to jail.
You assassinate an archduke.
I mean, clearly that's where every game of rock, paper, scissors leads. And so it was really the only way to resolve a conflict. Either everyone obeyed the rules or somebody came and made them obey the rules at gunpoint. And that was all you had. But now with Bitcoin, nobody can really make Bitcoin obey any kind of rule at gunpoint. You could try and force all the different actors involved in Bitcoin to do something, but it would be extremely difficult because it's international. So you could ban everyone from transacting on it. You could ban everyone from mining it. you could try and block it at the country level. Whenever you see a Bitcoin looking packet exchanged over the internet, you could block that. Maybe that would work. Maybe if the 5 or 10 biggest countries in the world all agreed and decided that they really hated Bitcoin, they might be able to force it to stop existing. But otherwise, it'd be really difficult. And so now you have this system that doesn't obey rules of organized force. It obeys its own set of rules. And everyone can agree on and believe that this set of rules is going to be enforced. And so that's why I'd say it's like a government created out of thin air. It's the second thing that never really existed before that can resolve a conflict. Like if someone says, I move the money to A, I move the money to B. Well, you can't have moved it to both. And so Bitcoin resolves this. It's like, actually, A ended up getting incorporated first. A happened. And you're like, well, I'm the president of the United States, and I want it to go to B. And there's nothing you can do, even if you're the president. Even if you're, like, the emperor of China. I know they don't have an emperor. There's no amount of force you can bring to bear that's going to change what ended up happening in the blockchain. And that's the thing that I think is really unique and different and unappreciated about it, is that it's this form of, well, resolving a dispute that just never existed before. And I think it's probably a lot more efficient than using organized force to do it.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I would wonder how we could get that to apply to things outside of Bitcoin and the internet. And, how do you take those ideas and make them useful in everyday life? Do you make people do contractual obligations through Bitcoin and then have that arbitrate things or what?
Well, that's kind of the dream of Ethereum, right?
Yeah.
You have contracts, which are more complicated than just who owns what arbitrary value of Bitcoin. And in theory, you can enforce a contract through this. But then the problem sort of comes in, how do I make this contract interact with the real world?
Besides just taking money.
Yeah, because we already have one of those. It's Bitcoin. So for Bitcoin, it's really easy. You pay someone real money, or I don't know, ask them to move the money, or threaten them with force to move the money, or whatever. Use some kind of real world mechanism, and you say, please move the money from A to B, and then they can move it. And now everyone knows that the Bitcoins have been moved to B. But in the case of Ethereum, you create a smart contract, and you're like, let's move an asset from owner A to owner B. So everyone in the Ethereum blockchain can see, all right, this asset's now owned by B. But then if you move back into the real world, who cares? Like, what system or people or whoever care that this asset is owned by B in this Ethereum blockchain? What's going to enforce that? And the blockchain really only has domain over itself. Like, if you look at how difficult it is to move money between blockchains, it's actually extremely difficult, because a blockchain doesn't really have a way to refer to the external world, and it doesn't really have a way to input data. Like if you wanted to make a blockchain that tracked stock prices, it's actually really difficult. Now you have this weird trust problem where you're like, well, what if everyone lies about what the stock prices are? How do I make it have the real data? And it's actually really, really difficult. And so if you flip it around and you say, how do I make this blockchain have an effect in the real world? Really, it has to have something where everyone agrees that it has an effect in the real world. And it's like, well, why is everyone going to agree about this Ethereum contract? And I feel like they're not really publicly trying to solve that problem in any way that I find compelling. Like, I see something that's like, well, let's say we have a car, and the car has a computer in it, and the computer has cellular internet, and so it can go check the Ethereum blockchain. And so the car looks for records that say this car is owned by whoever has this public key or whatever. And so then you would have a physical instantiation of your public key on the Ethereum blockchain in like your key fob. So you get in the car and you do a cryptographic handshake with the car's computer, and it's like, okay, you own me, you're allowed to drive me. And so then when we want to sell the car, instead of doing a more expensive title transfer, I just move the car's ownership over to you in the Ethereum blockchain. But then someone would be like, well, what if I go in the car's computer and I just mess with it and I remove who owns it? And it's like, oh, well, yeah, you could do that, but we could make it illegal to do it. And it's like, well, why don't you just use that framework?
I thought you were going to say you were going to use the car and the threat of having the car kill you in order to enforce the contract in the real world.
I hadn't thought about that. I guess you could make the car sort of tamper-proof. If you tamper with it, then it tries to do benefit denial and break itself. then your first goal is defeat all the tamper-proof mechanisms, and then transfer it to yourself.
What if we break the door handle first?
Yeah. Or alternatively, someone who's purely malicious can just tamper with the car on purpose and then destroy it for really cheap. So that's also difficult to solve. But yeah, I feel like what ends up happening is you have these Ethereum smart contracts, and someone's like, well, how are we going to enforce them? And it's like, make it illegal to break them. And then you have nothing. That's sort of the opposite of what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And getting them to apply in the real world is like the hard problem. Like, people can already write contracts just on a piece of paper, and they can email them around. And what makes them be enforced? And it's governments. And so how are you going to enforce it without using a government? Like, if you say, like, here's an example contract. I'm going to do some work for you for 1 hour, and in exchange, you'll pay me $100. How can any system that only exists on the internet make you pay $100 and verify that I did the work?
What if you make all participants put up a bond, and you make that bond grow in proportion to the kind of commitments that they make through the contracts? And so in order for someone to engage in a contract with you where they say they'll pay you $100 an hour for labor, and they only need 1 hour of labor, they have to have a bond of some multiple of 100.
That would work.
And that way, if they try to renege on it, then there's a bond that's already secured in order to fulfill the contract.
Okay. So that's something that people have thought about and tried. So first off, the most interesting thing about that is that's trivial to implement on Bitcoin. You don't need Ethereum for it. So if you're an Ethereum developer and you want to talk up Ethereum, you're probably going to want to not mention that Bitcoin can sort of already solve that problem. That would be a multi-sig transaction. Like, you could have a 2 of 2 or a 2 of 3 escrow type situation. So you say this money only moves if 2 out of 2 people sign it. Otherwise, it's effectively destroyed. Or this money only moves if 2 out of 3 sign it, and 1 of the 3 is a neutral arbitrating third party. But now you have different classes of problems. Like, is the bond equal to the value that you're transacting?
Are you asking how much should you have to put up?
Yeah.
In order to insure yourself?
Yeah, so if I put up a $10 bond to promise that I'm going to transfer 100 if the work is completed, now people can just look at it and be like, well, if you're selfish, you're just going to throw away the $10 bond and never transfer the 100. And so that's kind of cold comfort to the person doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have to put up, say you have to put up 1,000, then I can maliciously extort you. I can do the work, and I can be like, I did the work, you know I did the work, but I'm not going to sign off that you've actually transferred the money unless you pay me an additional 100 out of band. So then you pay me an additional 100 so your 1,000 doesn't get destroyed. And you're like, thanks a lot, malicious actor. And I'm like, pleasure doing business with you, thanks for the 200. And if you put up exactly the $100, even that, it's okay, but you lose all that liquidity. Because now you have to pay for everything in advance from a liquidity perspective, and then only transact it at the end. And so that kind of sucks too. It's probably the best of the different options.
But you probably still need to involve a third party that will verify that it's there.
Yeah.
And so then you'll have transaction fees and other problems.
Yeah, and that third party has to look at it.
You have trust issues, and you have to pay for that service.
Yeah, and then how do you know that third party isn't actually the same party?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, let's use my neutral friend Joe over here, and then actually I'm Joe. And so then I'm like, no, he never did the work. I'm not going to pay him. 2 out of 3, move the money back to me. And that guy is going to be like, but Joe. And it's like, heh. So how do you establish this neutral third party? Now you have roughly the same problem as like arbitration in the real world.
Yeah.
And it's going to cost a fair amount. And so then it only becomes useful at high dollar amounts. Like, say I'm asking someone to truck a shipping container full of Pentium processors harvested from the moon from one place to another. Then I'm going to pay a couple $100 probably for an arbitrator to really look at it and confirm that everything worked right and resolve disputes, if any. So now you've sort of lost the promise of smart contracts will change everything by giving everyone access to this legal framework. They don't do anything anymore. So I've thought about it a lot, and I wish that Ethereum smart contracts could do something, but I just don't see how. And it's kind of sad the promise of them would be amazing. If you think of something like, oh, we have all these servers communicating with each other over APIs, and they can pay each other 1,000th of a cent for moving data around or giving access to data. That would be amazing. There's so many things where you want a computer to automatically transact. Or like, to give a good example, I think, imagine if you walked into an airport and you put a budget on your phone that's like, I want Wi-Fi, but only at this price. And then your phone just negotiated for Wi-Fi, and it just gave you exactly as much as you ended up consuming at a price that you thought was fair.
That's funny.
That would be really cool. But how do you do that?
That's funny, because for years I've gone to gun shows, and I walk in, and like, you see hundreds of vendors, and you see thousands of tables covered with probably tens of thousands of guns. And you're like, somewhere in here, there's like 2 guns I'm interested in. And I've always thought, I wish there was like a kiosk or an app or something where I could just enter what I wanted, and then it would just automatically know what was here, and it would tell me where it is, and I could negotiate price.
Oh, from there.
And it would just simplify that down to a trivial problem with technology.
Yeah, it would be so cool. And I mean, you're sort of trying to solve a different problem there, because you want like autonomous negotiating agents, and then you could actually go settle up with dollars. So you don't need Ethereum even if it delivers.
Well, you could do it the same way. I could just say, I'm interested in buying this specific thing, and I want to spend no more than this amount of money. And then it would see if any vendor had said that they were willing to sell that thing for that amount of money.
Yeah, but I think you could accomplish this with a piece of paper.
Yeah, but why couldn't you do this with your internet? I mean, I don't really see the difference. I mean, you're just saying you want it to happen automatically. I want this to happen automatically too.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that makes sense. It's just such a high dollar amount. I think you can involve a person and you'd be okay. What I'm talking about is something where it's like 25 cents for internet. And so nobody is going to be a middleman for that. No human, because it could never be worth their time. For your thing, you could have a guy at the front desk, and all the vendors have a contractual agreement with him where he's not allowed to reveal their true minimum price. And so you come up to him and like give him your best offer, and then he does a second price pays auction or whatever for all the guns and like resolves them all at the end of the day or something. And then he's like, yeah, it turns out you got one because your offer was reasonable or something like that. I mean, that actually happens right now. Like, that's how Google ads get sold. Because you have this trusted, not really third party, I guess. You have a trusted first party because you trust that Google is auctioning the ads fairly. And they run a Vicaray style auction, which is second price pays. And so everyone bids on ad slots, and then the winners get them, and Google automatically deducts their money from their bank account and adds it to Google's bank account. And so like that works. That was the real innovation. Google isn't a great search engine. Google is an advertising company, and they set up this really efficient auction to be able to sell ads. And that's really their true breakthrough technology. But it would be really cool if it was like trustless. But I just don't see how Ethereum's going to be able to deliver on those promises. And you would think after all this time and effort that somebody would have figured out something.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of lost faith in it and traded all of my Ethereum for Bitcoin, except for one Ethereum.
The hedge.
And then you kind of spoiled the whole Augur with parasitic contracts and everything. So you kind of spoiled that for me. I do wish that there was some prediction market that I could go to and try to hustle people.
Yeah. Did we explain parasitic contracts?
No, it was something you and I discussed after we stopped recording one week.
Oh, okay. Do you wanna explain it, or do you want me to?
Blake, what is a parasitic contract? I'm concerned.
Craig, what's Augur, and why were you excited about taking people's money with it?
Yeah, so Augur was going to be this prediction marketplace where people could go and basically somebody would pose a question and they would put up some amount of money, and then people would come in and they would buy and sell and trade shares of the answer to that question. And in essence, you would put your money where your mouth is, and you would harness the so-called wisdom of the crowds to figure out what the answer is, what the real answer is. And so you could say in the time between the NFL's AFC and NFC championship games and the Super Bowl, so the two Super Bowl teams are going to be for the year, in that time period, You could come on there and people who were confident in their ability to predict the winner could actually put up money and they could bet on it. And the price of betting would change dynamically with how many people had bet on one side or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you were taking an unpopular stance on the bet, your payout would potentially be greater. And then there was this whole separate system of reputation, which was its own kind of currency on Augur, where you would spend reputation points in order to be an arbiter who would say, yes, the New Orleans Saints won the Super Bowl. And if enough arbiters agreed, then you got back that arbitration money that you had spent to arbitrate that, plus a little bit more. And so it incentivized you to be honest. Otherwise, if you were the unpopular answer, you would lose all that money you would put up in order to try and answer the question. And so my dream was going on there and examining the questions and seeing which ones I believed people were taking irrational stances on and betting against that. And I guess this was probably 2013 when we went on the cruise together. You told me about Augur originally. And it sounded great, and I was really excited. And for years, I kept reading their blog posts, and they'd be like, beta's coming soon, for years. And I guess it's still in beta now, like 4 years later.
I don't know.
And I don't know if it's ever going to happen. And then finally, Blake was like, oh, yeah, there's this parasitic contract thing, which kind of spoils the whole deal.
Yeah. So I was really excited for TruthCoin, which was the initial project. And I believe TruthCoin still exists. And the goal of that is to do the same thing, but on the Bitcoin blockchain. And so that has some chance of working. The problem with Ethereum is Ethereum has these smart contracts, and a smart contract can have some data associated with it, and it can move money around on the Ethereum blockchain. And in determining what to do, it can look at any of the other data on the Ethereum blockchain to make its decision. So it can look at blocks or money that's been moved or whatever. And so that means that there's effectively no private or secret data on the Ethereum blockchain. So if somebody is going to create a prediction market, one of the first things it requires is the thing Craig talked about, which is an honest feed of information. Like if somebody wins the Super Bowl and people have bet on it, one of the most important problems to solve is how do we enter into the official record who won the Super Bowl and not have anyone manipulate it? Because if someone figures out how to manipulate the prediction market, they can just bet against what the real outcome was, then forge a fake outcome, and then take everyone's money. And that's a huge problem. It comes back to blockchains have no way to interact with the real world. They depend on people and incentives. So if you have Augur running on the Ethereum blockchain, you're going to be writing out the results of predictions somewhere on the Ethereum blockchain. So someone else can just copy paste, basically, the Augur code and just make it point to the real Augur predictions that actually occurred, but not charge transaction fees. So everyone will be able to trust that these are the most legitimate answers that anyone could find because they're the Augur answers. And in theory, Augur is the leader of prediction markets on the Ethereum blockchain, but it won't charge a fee. So if you're going to bet on a prediction market, you're going to use the one that has no fees. And people are incentivized to build this. So this type of contract will be called a parasitic contract because it's a parasite on top of the Augur one, which in theory has this complicated system of incentives to cause all the actors to act honestly. And in theory, they all get paid for their honest actions, but in practice, they won't get anything, or they'll get nearly nothing because there's no incentive to transact on this higher transaction fee network. And so it'll drive down the value of honest predictions on Ethereum to near zero, which will actually sort of hurt how honest the predictions can ever be. So maybe it can exist. Maybe you can have Augur and it can have this huge parasitic load of contracts and all of the arbiters on there are just like almost doing it out of charity, but then it's sort of never really very trustworthy. Eventually somebody will get a bunch of arbiters together, collude, scam all the Ethereum out of somebody or all the Ether, and then everyone will lose faith in the market and they'll be like, oh, I wish we could have seen this coming. How would we know this would happen? But it'll be too late.
Yeah, and part of what made Augur so exciting was that prediction markets are treated as gambling. So the government takes a dim view on them. And so, I don't know. I'd like to think that I'm reasonably better at predicting things than the average person. So I was excited for it and for the chance to actually get to do prediction markets in an environment that the government wouldn't immediately shut down.
Yeah, it would have been cool. There's still a possibility. I think Truthcoin could still succeed, but I just don't think Augur on Ethereum can succeed. Or maybe if they can create some sense of like private state, I don't know. It'll be really complicated. Let's see. So I asked around, I told other people I was going to be doing this podcast, and I was like, do you have any questions about cryptocurrencies? And they did. Maybe not.
What is Bitcoin going to?
Yeah. $300,000 per coin. You heard it here first.
That's great. The highest serious prediction that I've heard that was actually attempted to be backed up by some kind of analysis was $1 million.
Wow. I don't know if that's optimistic or pessimistic.
Pessimistic, you mean because what would the state of the world have to be for that to happen?
Yeah. So you have $21 trillion of Bitcoin market cap, and then where's the rest of the money in the world?
Does that assume some amount of lost Bitcoins?
Yeah, a lot of it is lost.
Okay.
I think like half. Yeah, so it would be more like 10 trillion market cap of Bitcoins. So there'll only ever be 21 million Bitcoins, but a lot of, especially initial 50 Bitcoin transactions that were mined, have never moved. And so people suspect that they're on hard drives that have been thrown in the trash, or people lost the private keys to them, or whatever. So the true supply of Bitcoin is a lot lower than 21 million, which means each corresponding Bitcoin that you own is worth a lot more than it would seem. Let's see. I got this question. Isn't Bitcoin a failed experiment? I don't think it's really failed. It's worth a lot of money. So I feel like that indicates that it's succeeded in some way. I guess the way that I describe Bitcoin to people is it's like a better gold. Gold is a pretty good store of value. It's not really that people use it. It's not really that it's valuable, but the confidence that exists in people's minds around the world that gold is worth something is very high. And I think Bitcoin is rapidly approaching that level of confidence where people are like, yeah, it doesn't hurt to own a little gold. There's only so much gold in the whole world. Eventually you'll mine all the gold in the Earth's crust, and then there, you're done. That's all the gold. And similarly, you mine all the Bitcoin, and then that's it. So it's a very hard currency. It's a lot harder than gold, I would argue, because you can always spend a little bit more effort and mine a little more gold, but eventually you won't be able to spend any more effort to mine any more Bitcoin. And I think Bitcoin's definitely succeeded at competing with gold, and I think it's going to continue to compete really favorably with gold. And so it's at least that useful and that valuable. As useful as exchanging yellow hunks of metal, or exchanging pieces of paper that claim that you own a yellow hunk of metal that's in a vault somewhere, I promise. And it's totally not adulterated with tungsten or something like that. And I think Bitcoin's going to possibly replace gold. I don't really see any reason why gold's a lot better.
I read an interesting article a few weeks ago, and it was talking about kind of some interesting things that have been going on with the price of silver lately, and how silver has not acted in price the way you would predict based on what gold has done recently and based on other things that have happened in the market. And this author had the theory that essentially the smaller money that would normally stay away from gold and go into silver is instead going into cryptocurrency.
Oh.
It's kind of the same problem that we talked about earlier with penny stocks. You see an ounce of gold is, I don't know, $1,200 or something. And an ounce of silver is like $15 right now, something like that. And so people see that and they think, oh yeah, an ounce of silver is much cheaper. And so if somebody was interested in buying precious metals in the past, but they didn't have as much money, then they would buy silver traditionally. And now those kind of people who don't have as much money to invest, but want to get into some kind of store of value like that, and because they don't have as much money to invest, they're probably younger, they're probably more tech savvy. The hypothesis was they're getting into cryptocurrency instead. And that's why this anomalous price action in silver is going on.
I wonder, okay, so I guess they did some analysis where they're like, gold has moved like this, silver has moved up or down, it's moved up in a weaker way, or it's moved down against gold. And so then they could say that has affected the market cap of silver in this way, in terms of extant ounces of silver times the dollar valuation of the last share traded. And then, do you happen to know how proportional that market cap change is to the total cryptocurrency market cap change? Because you could compare those numbers.
Yeah, you could. I can find you the article. It's by an author I follow.
Okay. I'd be interested.
So I can easily find it for you.
Because if silver's down by like $10 billion, but crypto has only seen like $1 billion of investment in the same time period, they're probably wrong. It's not all going to crypto.
Right.
But if it's similar, that would be really interesting. That would be like, yeah, maybe that's exactly what's happening. And that would mean that an attack on gold is probably coming at some point in the future. Let's see, I also got, what's the use case of Bitcoin? Oh, well, I guess I'd say a better gold. I think it is a better gold.
Isn't it just used for buying guns and drugs and human trafficking? People use it for crimes, Blake.
Guns and human trafficking? I haven't heard of this.
Yeah. People use it in the dark web for crimes.
The dark web. Is that the same as the deep web?
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Uh,
And the ultra deep web.
Yeah.
The ultra deep field web.
It is used some for crime. It's really useful for international crime because you don't have to involve two different countries and maybe a third country where like the money processor exists in transferring your money. So like if you're committing fraud against Germans from Russia and you want to use like Western Union to move your money, which I think they're maybe based in the US, I don't know, I haven't looked it up. Then you would involve the US, which is definitely the scariest actor to involve. And then you also involve your government and the government of the person you're attacking. And with cryptocurrency, you involve this second kind of government that really does not care because none of the miners care where the money's coming from or going. They just care that it has a transaction fee. And so it's kind of good in that way. But then you still have to usually convert your dollars to bitcoins and your bitcoins to dollars. And getting attacked at the exchange point is still a problem. Like if you're committing crimes and you're worried about the government, at some point you're going to try and pull $1 million out of Coinbase, who has to comply with US Know Your Customer laws. And then that's where they're going to get you. So it's not some kind of magical avoid jail free card where it's untraceable cryptocurrency and no one knows where it is or where it goes or anything like that. In order to make it have impact on the real world, which has kind of been the theme of the podcast, you have to interact with the real world. And that's where governments sit and wait to catch criminals.
It has complete anonymity.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
I just like how specious the argument is. Like every type of value is used to commit crime.
Yeah, pretty much.
And to finance crime and any type of store of value or currency or anything else.
People commit crime using Counter-Strike items. Like Counter-Strike Global Offensive, the video game. Apparently you can move items around in that, and people run like illegal gambling rings using that stuff. So yeah, totally. And I'm pretty sure that like the number one currency of crime is physical US dollars. Unless you're going to be like, oh, actually it's the banks who are the criminals. Well, then they're still using digital dollars, so whatever. It's still the US dollar. I think that's the number one crime currency. So Bitcoin isn't really threatening the dollar anytime soon as the currency of choice for criminals.
Well, that brings us to our next question. Isn't it just going to zero?
Why? Why would it go to zero?
Because I don't understand anything about it. I'm angry that I didn't get in early.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And it would make me feel better if everybody lost everything and it went to zero.
I have seen people who I think they would not describe themselves as feeling that way, but that's the way they come across. They're like, you're all investing in a bubble. This is the tulip bulb thing all over again. It's totally tulips. Or the 2008 crisis, you're responsible. But Bitcoin is a better gold. It's a good way of moving around value. I think the trust is there now that it's valuable. Whether you like Bitcoin or not, do you not believe that someone would buy it for $1,000 per coin from you? Like, my confidence is really high that someone somewhere will pay more than $1,000 for a Bitcoin. And I don't expect it to go below that soon. It's probably never going to go as low as 10. Those times have long since passed. And so when you can be confident that many, many people in the world will accept your asset for some certain amount of money, then the confidence is really high. And that's really all you need, because value is this sort of fictional concept that exists in the minds of yourself and others. And as long as you have the strong belief that that concept's going to continue to exist, the thing is valuable. And I see a lot of interesting philosophical discussions about intrinsic value. Oh yeah? Gold's not that valuable. It's not that useful. Oh no, well you can gold plate stuff and it has use as jewelry. And it's like, so, I mean, if all of humanity is wiped out, gold's not actually valuable. It doesn't do anything. And similarly, Bitcoin doesn't do anything either. But if there's some people around and they can transact either of these, they're going to find value in both of them. If the internet is wiped out, I guess Bitcoin would lose value compared to gold. But how likely is that?
If that happens, I'm not going to be worried about my Bitcoins.
Yeah. And you'll have traded dollars for them. How useful are your dollars if the internet is wiped out? Maybe they're useful, but probably not. You're pretty screwed. That's going to be like, in my day, we used 9mm bullets as money or whatever.
Why would you do that?
What?
Use ammo as money.
I don't know.
You would just use the ammo to just kill the people and take their stuff.
Oh, yeah. I've had that discussion with people, too. They're like, oh, I have all these provisions prepared in case of disaster. And I'm like, really, all you need is a gun and a map to your neighbor's houses that have provisions.
Do you know any Mormons?
Hey, Mormons are often well armed. Don't mess with Mormons. I think it's probably a good cultural value to have. An armed culture is a culture that survives a long time. Take note, unarmed cultures. Let's see. Oh, I've had people ask me about using Bitcoin at stores. Like, can I buy a cup of coffee with it? I think the answer is no. I think you probably won't really ever be able to. I would have answered this question the other way, like 4 years ago. I would have been like, yeah, it'll be awesome. You'll just take your phone and you like boop it against a thing that has that weird B logo on it, and then you'll buy a coffee. But through a few inadvertent choices, I think that's not likely anymore. One of the reasons is initially Bitcoin didn't have a limit on its block sizes. And people said, well, what if people incorporate a million little transactions that are of no consequence, and they do that over and over? The Bitcoin blockchain will grow just gigabytes per day, and it'll be too difficult for anyone to store, and it'll kill our little experiment before it gets off the ground. So Satoshi was like, all right, I'm going to add a 1 megabyte limit to the blockchain because that's a lot of transactions. And so it'll just be 1 megabyte for now, and it can be extended in the future. It can be extended by all the miners agreeing to extend it. And so then all the miners didn't want to extend it. It did get extended. Now it's 2 megabytes, but that's still not very much. And pressure on getting a transaction incorporated into a block is only going to increase. And that means that your fee is going to increase to get your transaction in.
Does the block size affect throughput?
Yeah, because you can only mine a block every... I always get this wrong. It's either every 10 minutes or 6 minutes. And the difficulty factor of Bitcoin adjusts to try and keep that rate the same.
Okay.
It's so that it doesn't generate a block every 1 second and no one can keep track of stuff. So it means you can only add 2 megs of records per 10 minutes.
Okay.
Let me check that.
So why won't the network just agree to increase the block size at some reasonable rate? Like 4 or 8 megabytes in order to keep the throughput at some relevant value?
I guess they could have done that. It would have had to be incorporated into the original design. Okay, it looks like the target is 10 minutes between blocks. I think you would have run into the same problem that I was just talking about. If the goal was to incorporate all the transactions, then people could create lots and lots of little like millionth of a cent transactions. And then miners would try to incorporate them all, but it would mean that the blockchain grew at this ridiculously high rate. It would mean you could do things like write MP3 files into your transaction records just to store them. And then everyone would have to pay the cost forevermore of storing that data. Probably a better mechanism would have been to come up with a way to charge for the space that your transaction took up. But like, if you transact Bitcoins, then miners get to take some tax out of wherever the Bitcoins go forevermore. And so it encourages you to keep the smallest number of wallets for the amount of money. But it gets into this really complicated scheme, and as we talked about, incentives are really important. And it's sort of like, how's everyone incentivized to do the right thing? And people would say, oh, you can hold Bitcoin, but then gradually your wallet just drains over time. And that's really unattractive. You don't want an asset where it just sort of leaks away, like dollars do with inflation. And I don't know what could have been done. But anyway, it's the world we live in now. So you can only have 2 megabytes of transactions every 10 minutes, or you can have 12 megs per hour, which is not very many transactions. And so it means lots of people around the world want to transact Bitcoin, and they have to pay ever higher fees to make sure that their transaction gets incorporated into a block. And right now that fee, I believe, is getting competitive with the cost of a cup of coffee. So no one's going to be buying a cup of coffee with Bitcoin because their fee would be just as high as the good they're buying.
Oh, okay. I understand.
So one of the things that people are hoping for with other cryptocurrencies that are coming out is that maybe someone solves this problem and they create the cryptocurrency that's the currency of booping your phone at a point of sale terminal and buying a coffee. And right now I think IOTA, IOTA, is the strongest contender for that, but I'm not so convinced that I've bought any yet. But they seem like they might have some kind of path to success with that. It'd be really cool, but I think it's going to be more along the lines of exchanging virtual chunks of gold with other people. And so the real use case I see is investment firms and businesses using it to settle transactions or to store value. And right now, if someone says, well, why aren't they doing that right now? The answer is because the volatility is through the roof. Like in a given month, you don't know how many thousands of dollars Bitcoin's going to be worth right now. Mm-hmm. It might be 3, might be 4, might be 5. Maybe by the time this podcast comes out, it'll be 5K per coin. And so if you're a business, you are not excited about taking on that kind of risk. And it's really difficult to hedge against because you'd have to also short Bitcoin on the other end. And then you have to have someone managing all those transactions for you. So I think Bitcoin is still probably years off from stability. And a lot of people are probably excited to use Bitcoin, but they're just waiting on stability. And if you say, well, what about other cryptocurrencies? Well, they're going to get stable a lot later than Bitcoin is. So I don't think any other cryptocurrency is more exciting in terms of stability. However exciting stability is. I'm really excited for the value to never change. Woo! I don't know. I got a question about why did it fork? Did you know that happened?
Yeah. Let me think. Just recently they forked into Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. And I thought it had to do with the transaction throughput.
It did.
And there was some minority that did not want the change, and the majority said, yeah, we do want to support an increase in throughput or something like that. Maybe I have that backwards.
Yeah, that's backwards.
Okay.
The majority wanted 2 megabyte blocks, and the minority, the Bitcoin Cash people, wanted 8 megabyte. And I think also they wanted to continue increasing it. And Bitcoin Cash hasn't died, but it's actually this really complicated beast. So we have this idea of hashing power, which is like how many people are trying to hash blocks to be able to earn Bitcoins. That's all the miners around the world, like however much hashing they're doing. And someone who's mining Bitcoin can point their mining rig at Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash. It requires the same algorithm. And so they can be mining either thing with equal ease. And so Bitcoin Cash knew that by forking, the majority of mining power was going to go to regular Bitcoin. But they would still be stuck with, because they're a fork, it means that essentially both of them have the same history. They have the entire Bitcoin blockchain up to the point that they fork, and then they're basing their future blocks off of slightly different rules. And so in order to create a new block on Bitcoin Cash, you would have to achieve this difficulty factor that we talked about, like get a hash below a certain value, except the value is crazy low if you don't have roughly the same amount of hash power that you had before. So if 90% of the people go on and mine regular Bitcoin and only 10% mine Bitcoin Cash, it means that it's going to make blocks at roughly 1/10 the speed. And I believe the split was actually a lot worse than that. I think it was less than 10% of people went to mining Bitcoin Cash. And so they knew this was going to be a problem. They're like, oh, we're going to fork, and then it's going to take forever to mine the first block and the second block and so on. And then eventually, every about 2 weeks, the difficulty gets retargeted, which means all the miners look at all the blocks that have been mined before, and then they change the difficulty factor so that it'll take about 10 minutes to make a block. But they were still really far away from a difficulty retargeting. So they added the emergency difficulty adjustment algorithm, which said if difficulty should drop really, really fast, go ahead and drop it really fast. So they mined blocks extremely slowly for a while. Then the emergency difficulty algorithm kicked in, and it dropped the difficulty to mine a Bitcoin Cash block. And so you think, okay, well, Bitcoin has most of the value. No one cares about Bitcoin Cash. But then what ended up happening is Bitcoin Cash became really profitable to mine because it was not very difficult to mine.
Yeah.
So then a whole bunch of people jumped on it and started mining it. And the difficulty factor is allowed to just go up in the same way that Bitcoin does. So it's just going to go up and get retargeted in the same way. Then if people drop off mining, it'll emergency adjust down. So it looks like what Bitcoin Cash is in for is this cycle of the difficulty ramping up and then suddenly dropping off a cliff over and over. And its value is probably also going to fluctuate in a corresponding way. So every time the value goes up, more people will mine it. And then they'll drive the difficulty up. Then they'll jump off of it and go back to Bitcoin Core. And then the difficulty to mine will go down. But relative to the price, it'll become efficient to mine. I hope I'm explaining this well enough. But basically, it's going to keep cycling over and over. Which, if you care about transacting in this cryptocurrency, this sucks. Because it means the blocks are going to get mined, sometimes with huge gaps in between. And it'll take a really long time to confirm transactions. And it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. I think, if anything, this is going to really harm the currency. I think it didn't have a good chance before, but it really has a bad chance now with these cycles. Like, you'll look at how volatile it is, and it'll be crazy volatile, and how stable it is, and the price is just going to go up and down. I think it's probably doomed, but I don't know. We can check back in a year and see how accurate my prediction was. Maybe 8 megabyte blocks are enough. But we've seen a lot of other cryptocurrencies that are technically really interesting compared to Bitcoin, and no one cares about them anymore because they're dead.
Yeah.
So I think Cash is headed that way too. Are you familiar with the DAO hack?
With the what?
DAO hack?
Hack?
It's DAO. Yeah.
Was that one of the exchanges that got hacked or what?
No. All right. So I'll explain this then. This is one of the things that makes me more bearish on Ethereum. So some people came up with this really great idea on Ethereum to use smart contracts to create the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, or DAO, DAO. And their idea was to create sort of a decentralized venture capital firm. So people would be able to promise to deliver some sort of return on investment. They would say, I'm going to create a company that does this, and I'll pay you back if you fund me or whatever. And then investors in the DAO would be able to vote on shares and redirect money to these people, and in theory get paid back when the venture paid off. It's a really cool idea. The idea of a distributed VC firm, that's really neat. And it wouldn't be beholden to any kind of regulations around this. So it would be like really low cost, really efficient. And in theory, you could use the wisdom of the crowds, as you put it, which would probably be more like stupidity of the crowds, but whatever. It would let people invest in all kinds of stuff. And it sounded really cool. People bought a bunch of DAO tokens on the Ethereum blockchain. They raised $150 million from more than 11,000 contributors. Yeah, that's a lot of money. So it's 150 million in imaginary ether. It's not necessarily in real dollars. And it turned out that the smart contract that they made, which is programmed in a language that's like roughly JavaScript, not known for its security properties, had a vulnerability. So it let someone create this fake child DAO. Like the DAO splits into more DAOs, and then those invest in things. And it let them create a fake child DAO. and then they siphoned all the ether out of the original DAO. And they drained 3.6 million ether, I think, before anyone was able to do anything about it, which was roughly $50 million at the time. It's worth a lot more money now. And the Ethereum Foundation's response to this wasn't, well, that's too bad. This is working as intended, which I would argue it was. The smart contract worked. The person successfully did what we would call in the human world an exploit, but according to like the code world, the blockchain world, they did something fully within the rules of the system, and they moved the money to themselves. And then the blockchain correctly recorded that they had moved the money, and everything was fine. But in the human world, everyone was flipping out because it looked like Ethereum got hacked and people just stole a bunch of ether. And that's not really what happened, but that's kind of what it sounded like. So the Ethereum Foundation said, okay, let's hard fork Ethereum. And the way they hard forked it was they created a new version of Ethereum, which they just call Ethereum, that just moved all the ether from the hacker's wallet to a new address. And then it allowed the DAO curators to disperse those funds back. So effectively, from the rules of the blockchain, it stole all the money back out of this guy's wallet that he had legitimately gotten, and then redistributed it to everyone that it originally came from. So essentially, they implemented a technical version of backsies. In my opinion, in the cryptocurrency world, no backsies. So there are other people who agreed with this, and they forked Ethereum, or another way of thinking of it is they just didn't follow the Ethereum Foundation's hard fork. And so they've kept Ethereum running under Ethereum Classic, which just kept obeying the rules of Ethereum as they were set out. Essentially, they're the no backsies chain. And people thought, oh, that's dumb, it'll die, because only one of them's the real one. It still hasn't died yet. It's not worth very much. It has a market cap of $1.4 billion right now, which is like it's not that much money as a cryptocurrency goes, but that's still some real money. And I feel like whatever confidence I had in Ethereum before this was forever shattered by them doing this. I feel like you cannot go steal all the money out of somebody's wallet because you don't like the thing that they did and then expect people to trust your cryptocurrency.
Yeah, and what concerns me about that story is you said the Ethereum Foundation. And so apparently there's a group of people with the power to do this?
Yeah, power is different in the cryptocurrency world. Essentially, they patched the code and said this patch is going to have this effect of stealing all the money back out of this guy's wallet. Please run this code. And then enough people mining Ethereum said, okay, and ran that code.
Okay, so it's still required a majority of the network.
Yeah, that's how you vote in the cryptocurrency world. You change the code, and then you heavily try to persuade everyone to run your code. But they have to voluntarily do it. And so that's another reason I say it's different than a government. Because you can imagine the government trying to pass a law where they have to get everyone to agree to follow it. The majority of people have to sign off on the law, otherwise it just doesn't get followed. And also, if you don't agree with the law, you can just fork the country and start your own country where no one agrees with that law. And that's kind of the world that cryptocurrency lives in. You're just like, fine, I'll just make my own currency right here. And because it doesn't have geographic boundaries, you can do that.
Yeah, that worries me about some other cryptocurrencies I've read about where they have things like pre-mined currency that's going to be doled out in the future, and they'll have it on these schedules that it'll be given out on and things like that. And it's like you're putting a lot of trust in like a small group of people, and you're hoping that they won't break the rules. And you're hoping that at some point they'll say, oh, we're sitting on 60% of all the currency that will ever exist for this cryptocurrency. And if we just went ahead and sold it all into the market tonight while everybody's asleep and fulfilled all the open buy orders, we'd make $2 billion and screw everybody. But we don't care. Let's do it.
That's true.
And you're just relying on them to be honest.
It would kind of crash the market.
It would, but they wouldn't care.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the selling all the coin off thing, but that's a real possibility. The way I view it is, say I'm going to create a cryptocurrency, like have my initial coin offering for Blakecoin. Probably something I would do is write a rule into the coin that said, I'm going to pre-mine like 50% of it, but I'm not allowed to move those coins around for 2 years or something like that. And then I would heavily publicize that fact. So it would mean my coin would have to exist for 2 years and be worth something before I could sort of have my exit or my liquidity event where I sell off all my coins. I think some coin creators have done that to try and instill confidence in their coin. But a lot of them, I think, have recognized that they don't need to do that, and stupid people will buy a bunch of their coin anyways, and it's effectively a pump and dump scheme, and then those people get screwed.
Right.
But I used to think pre-mining was really crappy. It just sort of feels unfair, right? Like, someone's like, I've created this cryptocurrency, P.S. I own half of it. Why don't you guys mine it and transact it as if it's a real thing? And it's like, you jerk, you already took half of it. But I've really changed my view completely on that, where it's like, well, if this cryptocurrency is valuable, why shouldn't this guy get rewarded an enormous amount for creating it? And like another analogy would be, say the guys who invented TCP/IP, like, if they could have made $1 billion for it by pre-mining all the TCP packets, would I have a problem with that? Like, no, they should absolutely make $1 billion for it. $1 billion would be a paltry price for the world to pay for the value that their invention gave. And similarly, I feel that way about Bitcoin. Like, Bitcoin's worth more than $1 billion in terms of value that it's created, market cap aside. It lets people transact in this way they couldn't before, and it enforces rules in this different way. And so, I don't think pre-mining is really bad anymore. I think it's probably a good way for a coin author to get rewarded. But like you said, a lot of them are sort of misusing it. Incidentally, IOTA, that coin I talked about before, was 100% pre-mined.
Mm-hmm.
Which I feel like that kind of sucks, because if you want people to use your cryptocurrency, maybe they should have a way to earn it by using it. But instead, everyone has to try and calculate in their head, how many dollars is this worth? I think they did that because it simplifies the coin. One of the things that's a little complicated in Bitcoin, or not complicated, but adds complexity, is the blocks have to reward the miners. But the idea in IOTA is that it doesn't have blocks exactly. Instead of having a blockchain, it has this thing called the tangle, which is just a directed acyclic graph. So there are many transactions going on all the time. Many of them can be unconfirmed. You have to know about a lot of transactions to know for sure what's going on. And so it would be really hard to have a single block reward, because there's not really a single chain where it's like, oh, everyone agrees that block 1000 happened in the past, and that guy got a 50 Bitcoin reward for it. So they were just like, well, let's just pre-mine all of it, and then it doesn't have to reward you for using it. But it also means it can't reward you for using it, which kind of sucks.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sort of just waiting around. If IOTA ever becomes worth anything, then I'll just buy it for dollars, or I'll buy it with my Bitcoins, and that'll be fine. And so I don't have a lot of incentive to try and like invest in it early, because I feel like my investment could only, I guess it couldn't only fail, but it just seems silly. If they're ever going to be a medium of exchange, just a currency, I can convert dollars to IOTA, transact, and then IOTA back to dollars. And I won't really care about how much the early investors in it made.
Mm-hmm.
But with Bitcoin, there's some reason to invest in it, because it's more like gold. It's not going to get transacted furiously all the time. And so holding Bitcoin is a legitimate strategy for Bitcoin. What got you to buy Ethereum in the first place?
Augur.
Oh, okay. But wouldn't you have still had to buy Augur tokens, whatever those are called?
Those are just for the reputation, so you can be an arbitrator.
Oh, okay. Why didn't you just decide to buy Ethereum with dollars if and when Augur ever took off?
Because I was sure that it was going to happen, and I was sure that I would want to play around on Augur. So I thought, why not go ahead and buy it now?
Yeah, okay.
And, you know, it did pay off really well, so.
That's true. I kept seeing a thing that was like, the event the Ethereum people were calling it was the flippening, where the market cap of Ethereum would be higher than the market cap of Bitcoin. And I think it was looking like that was going to happen just imminently. I'm not sure if that ever happened, though. Ethereum has 45% of the market cap value of Bitcoin. It would need to have 100% to have flipped. So, doesn't look that close. And for a while, I was kind of worried. I was thinking, am I missing the boat on this stupid speculative instrument, and I should actually buy some Ethereum? But then I looked at the hashing power, which is like how much effort is going into mining the two currencies. And Bitcoin has so much more than Ethereum.
Mm-hmm.
And hashing power is the true thing that secures the network. If you have the majority of hashing power, you are the one true coin. And I don't think anything's displacing Bitcoin soon in terms of hash power. Ethereum's the next best contender, but I just don't think it's close. And I don't think Ethereum is very intrinsically useful above and beyond Bitcoin. So, I don't know. That was cute. There's a lot of... Oh yeah, that's another thing I wanted to talk about. I think it's really interesting how if you view Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies through this lens of they're like a second type of government, it answers a lot of why do I see such terrible people on the internet talking about it? Because people get like soccer hooligan levels of mad at each other about like forking Bitcoin. Like, these idiots just don't understand the value of 8 megabyte blocks. I don't understand how they could be so stupid. They're terrible people and they're trying to hurt everyone. And there's other people who are like, Bitcoin is hurting the environment with its mining. Look how much carbon is emitted by mining it. And there's all these people who are just crazy passionate in all these different directions. And if you think, why are they so passionate about a piece of software? Then they look stupid. But if you think, why are they so passionate about supporting a political alignment that they agree with versus disagree with, then it comes into focus. It's like, yeah, people really are like that about universal healthcare, for example. People are super angry about it in one direction or the other, and everyone thinks that their opponents are just malicious idiots. Like, they're stupid but malicious at the same time somehow. And that's how people act about cryptocurrency policy. And it's because cryptocurrency policy really is just like government policy. It has that same kind of effect. Once it's set, it can just affect your life and there's nothing you can do about it. And so you want to spend a tremendous amount of mental energy on changing people's minds to align more closely with yours. And it's at the level of like religious fervor. And I think that's really why. It's like, it's basically this government. You're trying to convince people to pass a law, except they have to pass it in this weird way where someone makes a code change and then everyone else has to majority agree to run your code if they're already in a position of power.
And the minority just breaks into its own nation.
Yeah, they can do that. Yeah. And then they're like, should we? Yeah. And is it really a we? Because you can just use both currencies and you can mine on both. It's like, you split your nation into another nation, but it's still backwards compatible with the old nation. Like, everyone still owns the same properties that they owned at the time if they didn't transact them. And everyone still has the same social security number, but they have like a -1 or a -2 after it. It's really weird. Like, if you're really in favor of Bitcoin forking, even after it forks, you still own Bitcoin Classic. And so, are you a traitor? Like, no, you've become two people, sort of, in the government's eyes. It's really weird. It's this thing that's just never existed before. I think it's really interesting. Oh yeah, another thing. So I mentioned people are like, Bitcoin is hurting the environment with its carbon footprint with mining. Or mining is so wasteful. Initially there was this effort called Prime Coin, and they're like, can we make mining do something useful, like discover prime numbers? Yeah, how useful do you think discovering prime numbers is? I feel like I do not care very much about carbon emissions, but I don't think I would burn down very many trees in exchange for discovering a prime number. I'd be like, why don't we just leave them undiscovered? I just don't care. And it's interesting because sometimes you see an apt comparison and sometimes not, but the comparison is how much money does it take, or how many resources, to secure dollars. Like for $1 billion of Bitcoin versus $1 billion of dollars, what does it take to secure them? Because what mining does is it secures Bitcoins. It makes it so that no one can rewrite history, no one can deny you the ability to do your transactions, and for dollars, people secure dollars and ensures that you continue to hold them. No one prints more and inflates them wildly, although to some extent that does happen. But one of the security things they do is prevent counterfeiting. Like the US is essentially like, we're the only legitimate counterfeiter or issuer of dollars. And they use force to try and enforce that law. And so dollars are secured. Like, your dollars only inflate so much, and it's because of a great deal of effort. So then how much effort goes into it? How much effort do you think it takes to secure $1 billion? It's not zero. Like, everything that the Secret Service does towards preventing counterfeiting, everything that banks do to protect their money, everything that the FBI and local police forces do to prevent money from being stolen, like, all those things go into securing it. And it's a lot of effort. Like, there's a lot of effort in the finance industry that goes to securing dollars or other currencies. And I think that people think of that as, like, background noise. Like, oh, well, it's just getting secured anyway, right? That's something that we just all do. But they can look at Bitcoin and they see the sort of artificial looking securing of it in terms of mining. And they can point to that. They can calculate its value. And they can say, look how much carbon we're emitting or whatever. Look how wasteful. And it's just this very easily countable number. But I would argue that per dollar amount, Bitcoin's probably a lot more efficient at securing itself than dollars are. I don't know if dollars are the most efficiently secured currency, but it's a very commonly used one. And I think when you compare them, Bitcoin probably wins. I don't think you can have a currency without some kind of security on it. How would you do that? Everyone trusts everyone else? So, anyway, along those lines, Bitcoin secured with this thing called proof of work. So we already talked about that. That's like trying to find a hash that's below a certain value. And once in a while, people will float this idea of proof of stake. The Ethereum Foundation is very excited about proof of stake. And their idea there is, well, instead of burning resources, trying to produce very low hash values, we're just going to have people who own Ethereum, like, put up a bond, sort of like you've talked about, and then say that a transaction block occurred and, like, attest to it. And if everyone honestly attests to it, they all get to keep their stake. If some people defect, we have this way of detecting defectors and punishing them by burning their stake, essentially. The analogy I've seen is it would be like if you have a farm of computers that are mining, but if you mine illegitimately, your farm of computers, like, burns down. And it's kind of like that. Except that I would argue that there's nothing cheaper than proof of work. Like, for a proof of stake system, you'd say, oh, well, they won't have to burn a bunch of resources to mine blocks. All they have to do is own Ethereum and lock up that Ethereum in some illiquid way. But the cost of locking up that Ethereum, I think, will tend to be exactly the same cost as they would have been spending on proof of work. If the marginal, because you'll be earning Ethereum by mining blocks. So if the marginal benefit of mining a block is greater than the marginal cost to either acquire mining resources or acquire stake, people will figure out how to exchange money and other resources for stake until they've exactly matched the marginal cost and the marginal benefit. And so there's no way to distribute resources, which is what mining for new Ethereum does. It distributes resources. There's no way to distribute resources in a way where people won't try to influence it with everything that they have up until the marginal cost and marginal benefit are the same. And so they're going to burn those resources. I guess the benefit is the Ethereum Foundation can sort of wave their hands and be like, well, they're not burning computer cycles on mining, and they can pretend like no other resources are being burned. When in effect, people are going to be spending real dollars and real effort and all kinds of things in order to acquire Ethereum to put at stake so that they can earn it. But I haven't really seen any argument where they're like, oh, here's how we're going to solve the marginal cost, marginal benefit problem. Like, how would you do that? How would you make it so you can't spend more real world assets to increase your marginal benefit or decrease your marginal cost for mining? There's, like, no way that you can do it. And I think it's like such a red herring to talk about, oh, we're going to switch to proof of stake and then we're going to be so efficient. And then there's all these people who are like, oh, I care about the environment, but I also care about cryptocurrency. I don't know who those people are. But they're like, oh, Ethereum's going to be so much better for the environment. I guess they imagine all these Bitcoin mining plants just outputting black smoke into the air.
As they drive around in their vegan Tesla.
Yeah. There's an ozone hole literally above every Bitcoin mining facility. And it seems so silly. Like imagine you have this asset. You're like, I've created 1 million Craig coins or whatever, and I want to distribute them so that everyone gets 1 Craig coin. Like, how are you going to do that? You're like, oh, just come up to me and, I'll stamp your hand and give you a Craig coin. And if you have a hand stamp, you can't get another one. And it's like, well, what are they going to do? They're going to wipe the hand stamp off. And so, like, what do you do? Oh, I'll tattoo it on. Well, how much are Craig coins worth? Oh, $1,000. Okay, I'm going to get my tattoo removed. And you're like, oh, I'll use a special tattoo. And it's like, okay, I'm going to send my friends in to get Craig coins and then just give them to me. And you see that sort of pattern where it's like, if the thing is of value, people are going to figure out how to attain it.
Yeah, we're all engineers here. This is what we do for a living.
Fungineering.
We examine a system, we figure out how to game it to our advantage.
Yeah. And so how are you going to defeat someone who's willing to work for this asset? You're not going to be able to put a proof of not work in their way because they're just going to do work to figure out how to attain the asset. So I don't think anyone's going to be able to do any better. I think they'll be able to claim that they did better. Maybe that'll hold up for a while. But yeah, it's true. It's a lot of us are engineers. We try to game the system. And so the goal is to build a system where gaming it is the desired outcome. And that's what Bitcoin is. All right. Well, I think that's all I got about Bitcoin.
All right. What are we talking about next time? What's on?
Oh, that's right. You said you had a space shuttle story.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Man, I'm looking at the list here. There are a lot of NASA stories on this list. But you requested and you added to the list specifically stories about astronauts being stupid. And I thought of one. And thankfully he was not a test subject, so I can feel okay talking about this. So part of my job when I was there was we were like third level mission support. So, there was this guy in the mission control room at one of the desks, and then he was supported by a set of people in a second room, and then we were the third group behind that second group. So it kind of like spreads out like a tree of more and more engineers supporting these people because it's a lot of really complicated systems, and 2 or 3 dozen guys in mission control really can't represent complete technical knowledge of all the systems.
Yeah.
So they do rely on a lot of people below them, but you have this network set up in a way so that when there's a problem, you have an efficient way to get information and solutions up to the guy who's actually in mission control.
Yeah.
So we would be on call and we would be in our little support center, and we would be watching the video downlink and listening to the radios. And then we had this special telemetry software that would be processing the data downlink and interpreting it for our particular systems and displaying all the data that was relevant to the stuff we worked on. And then we would have the printed procedures. And whenever they were doing the robotic arm procedure stuff, we would be following along on the procedures and on the telemetry on the software and everything step by step and make sure they were doing it right. And in case something went wrong, we would know exactly what state everything was in so that we could help troubleshoot. Mm-hmm. And so one night we were doing this and they're moving the robotic arm around doing something, robotic arm stuff.
High-fiving other spacecraft.
Yeah. Other spacecraft would just run by in opposite direction orbits, and they would just high five.
It would be the most epic high five ever. It would be visible from the ground.
So on the end of the arm, they had this thing called the end effector. And what the end effector was, it looked like this big can. And it was basically what grabbed things. It was the physical interface that would grab stuff. And it was just this can. It had these special wires inside and this real contrived method of grabbing things, And there were these 3 sensors inside that would tell you the state of the end effector. And so those sensors would read out onto the aft cockpit in the space shuttle where the astronaut who was controlling the robotic arm would be controlling it from. And when he would tell the end effector to close and thus grapple something, those 3 sensors would all engage and they would go what's called barber pole, which means they would swap from essentially like open to close, and it was a physical readout. And so this little like piece of material would actually pop in place, and it would be a hashed white line. And that was called barber pole.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the binary state changed, it would go from just being clear to being barber pole because this little bit of material that was hashed white popped up in place. And so they're doing something one night, they're trying to grapple something, and they get 2 of the 3 sensors barber pole. And so the third sensor isn't showing that it's successfully grappled. And they're trying to figure out what to do. And it's not a very high stress situation because I think they were docked at the space station and the thing they were grabbing was still connected in the payload bay. So it's not like it was going to float away if they didn't grapple it quickly or something. So, there was no rush for any of it. So they're talking up and down on the radios, trying to figure out what's going on and trying to decide if they should release it and then re-grapple it. And I don't know why they didn't just do that right away. It would have seemed like, just try that. Just cycle the dumb thing and see if it grabs. See if it works right this time.
Classic troubleshooting.
It had these like wire snares inside that had to coil up a certain way. Maybe it didn't coil correctly. Just try it again. And so they're talking about it on the radio for like 10 minutes, and verifying the arms in the correct position and all the switches are right and that they're at the right point in the procedure and all this stuff. And then everything goes quiet for a minute or two and nobody's saying anything on the radio. And, everybody's just kind of thinking and we're kind of talking it over in our back room about what we think might be wrong. And suddenly the astronaut radios down and he goes, I tried tapping on the glass to see if the switch was stuck and would go barber pole, but that didn't work. Then they fought with it for, I don't know, another 5 or 10 minutes and then eventually fixed it somehow. But it was your tax dollars at work, $100 million space station, or $100 billion space station, and Lord knows how much for the shuttle program. And your best of the best of the best astronaut was up there. And that was his solution, was to tap on the glass to see if it would switch.
If it had worked, would he have gone ahead? That seems worrying too.
Yeah. I don't know if the barber pole had just been stuck and it had snapped into place when he tapped on it, I would have still liked for him to cycle the end effector.
Yeah. I feel like what you're describing happened in the movie Armageddon. Sorry, documentary Armageddon. Do you not remember the guy? He said, this is how we fix thing on Russian space station. And then he hit it with a wrench and it fixed it.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I believe that station was destroyed in a fuel explosion shortly after. So maybe that's meant to be a teachable moment.
Prophetic, maybe.
Oh, man.
Did you enjoy the Fungineering podcast? If so, send it to the smartest people you know, unless they have an MBA or a systems engineering degree. But in that case, you probably don't consider them smart to start with. Take a couple of the dollars you could waste on those useless degrees and instead consider supporting us on Patreon. The ultimate benefit to mankind will be greater than if we had another engineer with a useless MBA.